Hello, folks. Okay, who did the woo sound when you changed streams? I know Julie did. You've got to do the sounds. Okay, it's part of the transition from one scene to the next. We need to do. Cheers, everybody. Well, I hope you enjoyed that sing. It was great fun, wasn't it? It can't beat a bit of Henry VIII. It's your first deep dive lane. Well, fantastic, enjoy. Well, this is a change. We've been talking almost exclusively about music theory for 9 weeks, and if you've not seen those, they're all saved. We start at first principles. It gets a bit tricky a bit quickly, and then it gets easier again. Quite a few people, I think, in the second and third deep dive got the bends, so we slowed down a little bit. But we ended up having a look at a grade 1 music exam and found we can actually do quite a bit of it, some of us. So we'll be back to music theory in 2021. I thought it'd be good for me to share a bit of music history knowledge. So will you, ladies and gentlemen, join me in changing scene? There we go. So welcome, folks, to the first deep dive in music history. And well, format-wise, there's not going to be any singing. This is going to be me talking, and yeah, I could talk for hours and hours and hours and hours and hours on music history, as you will soon discover. I am fascinated with the development of music, in particular how it relates to humanity and society. And the study of music history, as the study of art history is the study of humanity, the study of society. And so there's some really fascinating aspects which I'm looking forward to sharing with you. Now, some people have messaged me and said, why aren't you starting right back at the beginning? Why don't we have a kind of complete history of music? And I may build up to that, but I've decided to start today by talking about the Baroque era. Now, the Baroque era, well, I'll show you in a minute. The Baroque era occupies a block of time from around 1600 to about 1750. And a lot of music that has come from that era speaks very much to us here in the 21st century. We listen to a lot of it, we play a lot of it, and it is, I think, the easiest way into classical music is to start with the Baroque era. Now, there was plenty of music written before, and of course loads written afterwards, but we'll start here. As I say, I think it's quite a useful doorway, if you like. So let's have a look to see first of all who's here. Lots of lovely people here. Goodness me, you just switched channels. How marvellous! Right, well let me zoom in a little bit here so I can talk to you about these eras. So I want to start by just saying, folks, when I talk about classical music, when you hear the term classical music, it can refer to two different things. First of all, it can refer to all of this, which is to say the entirety of Western European art music from around 1100 to the present day. If you listen to a classical music radio station, chances are that's what it means. Classical as in anything written before about 1950 for orchestra or choir. But if you see here on my little chart, there is also a classical era within classical music. And that's where you'll find composers such as Mozart and Haydn and so on. So the first thing to say is, if you think you know what classical music is, if you thought it was all of this, well, it is that, but it's also something else. So just to throw a particular spanner in the works, classical can mean one of two things, all right? But we're going to start by just talking about classical music as a whole, okay, looking up here. And so first thing I want you to notice, everybody, is if we look at this timeline from around 1150, I mean, we don't know for certain, of course, up to 1920, you'll see that there are some distinct eras in music history. And they have names like the medieval era, the Renaissance, Baroque, classical, early romantic, and then you've got post-war and post-modern, and then postmodern, and what we're living in now, which is goodness knows what. And what I find fascinating about this is a number of things. First of all, if you're a student of art, you will recognise a lot of these terms. Okay, a lot of art history is tied in with this, as is the study of architecture, as is the study of fashion. Everything is grouped together into these eras. But of course, it's not as if everybody woke up on January the 1st, 1600 and said, how marvellous, we're living in the Baroque era. Change everything, dear. You know, let's change the calendars, let's change everything. We're now in the Baroque era. These are very, very loose definitions, loose terms that cover actually a huge amount of human history. And so we're looking today primarily at the Baroque, but just to say, we will talk about the Renaissance era, we will talk about the medieval era, and I just want to point out here there's a very, very important date at around 1400 or thereabouts, 1450, and it was a very, very important development, this Herr Gutenberg's movable type. And I love the fact that you can pinpoint the origins of the Renaissance with the development of movable type. By Herr Gutenberg in, I think it was around 1450, and that sparked a huge amount of human creativity. Bearing in mind that prior to the Renaissance, if you wanted to write music down, well, you had to know how to write, you had to know how to read, and so the majority of music written down before 1400 was written down by those who could write, and that was, generally speaking, monks. And so a lot of the music we have from the medieval era is monastic music, plain chant and so on. Then you have the invention of movable type in the start of the 15th century, and then suddenly you have an explosion in art and creativity and music. And so for about 200 years, music developed rapidly. You started to get music written down. This is where we saw the first emergence of things like staves and notes and stems and all the stuff we've been looking at on the deep dive. And so by 1600, which is where we start our story today, we had a situation where throughout Europe, in particular Western Europe, you had a society where people were beginning to perform music in groups, beginning to read music. You started to see a break of the hold of the church and rich patrons over music, and so the Baroque was the beginnings, if you like, of the democratization of music. So everybody could enjoy, everybody could appreciate music. Maybe not everyone could perform it. That's when we get to the Romantic era, but the Baroque era is a really, really important stage. So let me just to compare. This is what a modern symphony orchestra looks like. I'm just going to zoom out of it. So this is a photograph here of a modern symphony orchestra. You can see here the conductor stands in the middle on the podium, the right place for him, and then you have what we call desks of violins here. Okay, so violinists sitting in pairs are called desks of violinists, and then you have viola players and cellos, and see there's dozens and dozens of players here, potentially hundreds of players in a modern symphony orchestra. A Baroque ensemble would have been much, much, much smaller. Here is a photograph of a Baroque ensemble by comparison. And so this is, you can see here, we have a flautist, someone playing a flute. You have a violin of some kind. Now this might look like a cello. It's not a cello. This is a viol. We'll talk about those. We have a harpsichord here and a singer. So we're talking about, whereas compared with modern symphony orchestra, Baroque ensemble is going to be really, really small, and usually only with single instruments playing one instrument per part. And just to give you an idea of the kind of era we're talking about here, 1600 to 1750, you're talking about this sort of scene. We're talking about roughs, we're talking about people who bathed once a year. There's that lovely quote about Queen Elizabeth I. She was a very clean woman. She bathed once a year, whether she needed to or not. So we're talking about this sort of era. People, no electricity, certainly no technology of any kind other than what you could make with your hands. Information passed down on parchment, written with quill and ink by candlelight, that sort of era. So if we can take our minds back in history to this point, I'm going to play you a little bit of music by an incredibly important composer to the Baroque era, and he's not actually a composer of choral music particularly. There are some pieces of his that have been turned into choral music, but this composer is primarily known for his instrumental music. This is Arcangelo Corelli, and I'm just going to play you a little bit of one of his concertos. Just have a little listen, and we're going to talk about what it is about this sound that is so Baroque. Okay, so just have a listen, please. And if you've got a cup of coffee or a cup of tea or a drink, have a sip and enjoy some of Corelli's Concerto Grosso in G minor. And this is Rinaldo Alessandrini conducting the Orchestre Philharmonique de Radio France in the Concerto Grosso in G minor. Here we go. Okay, so that's an example of one particular type of Baroque playing, and I'm sure you'll agree it's absolutely beautiful. You can close your eyes and let that music carry you away, and you can be certain once it starts there are going to be no unexpected surprises, no sudden booms or bangs. I mean, only 100 or so years after Corelli wrote this, Haydn was writing his Surprise Symphony, which has deliberately got loud crashes and bangs in it to wake up the audience who were falling asleep in the middle of his performances. And by the time you get into the Romantic era and you're listening to Beethoven and Mahler, you have to listen, because every 2 moments the mood is changing. There's a surprise, there's a new emotion, there's something to listen to. But Corelli's music is all about creating something. I'm going to use a term here which you can apply to Baroque music, and I've found this incredibly useful throughout the years. The term is seamless flow. Okay, and that's a term that's been used in music academia to describe Baroque music, particularly the music of Corelli. This idea that there is nothing that interrupts the direction of the music. That this is, you could probably hear it was slow. It was in a minor key. It had long, sinuous lines that interwoven. Once it started, you knew that, but until it ended, you were going to be in that sort of zone. And that's important to consider. Baroque music used something called terraced dynamics and terraced tonalities, so that you're not going to have sudden changes in the middle where it'll suddenly go fast. They'll wrap it up and then it will change. Okay, what follows on from that is a fast movement, which we'll listen to in a moment. But let's just let's go back to this idea, everybody, of seamless flow. No, I don't want that slide or that one just yet. There we go, the seamless flow. Okay, now for those of you who are still new to music academia and still learning these terms, please don't worry too much if the things on this slide don't make a lot of sense. But for those of you who are more experienced musicians, some of the things on here might leap out. But the seamless flow, as I say here on the slide, is one of the keys to understanding their motivations, these Baroque composers. They're trying to create a perfect example of the musical form. Bearing in mind that these rules that they're working with are still very new. Okay, by the time the Baroque era started, we're starting to see some of these chord shapes that we were looking at on the deep dive, these cadence progressions. In fact, I'm just going to get my, see if I can get the right sound here, bear with me. There we go. There's my harpsichord. So this is kind of the quintessential Baroque instrument sound. Here is a harpsichord, everybody, although it's a Japanese sampling approximation of a harpsichord. Okay, very, very distinctive sound. If you grew up in the certainly the second half of the 20th century, you'll be used to. Okay, it's very, very, very well-known use of the harpsichord as a riff. But actually, the harpsichord, if you hear a harpsichord playing along with a piece of music, there's a very, very good chance that you're listening to a piece of Baroque music, because the harpsichord is kind of at the heart of Baroque music. The harpsichord was primarily the way in which the rest of the instruments were kept together, and it was a way of filling in gaps in the harmonies that were created by these kind of simple lines at the top. So if we just to work through this slide, so the seamless flow can be characterized by things like melodies moving by step, and we were just looking at that with Henry VIII's piece, Pastime with the Company. Melodies aren't leaping around all over the place; they're moving by, if not predictable intervals, certainly intervals that are pleasing to the ear and are pleasing to perform. The exception is when you want to show high emotion. So if you are writing a tune and you want to make people feel particularly mournful or particularly joyful, you use a high interval. So rather than Next Door Neighbour, you'd have things like that. A wide leap would indicate more emotion. If you hear that in Baroque music, particularly on a violin or a woodwind instrument, it's going to carry your emotions with it. This next thing here, it says established cadential progressions. Now that sounds really, really complicated and so on, but if we just unpick that. Established, well, predictable, it's what you expect. Cadential. Now we're talking about cadences here. In particular, cadences, just for those who haven't been to the deep dive before, cadences are things like this. Okay, where you get chord 5, chord 1. Particularly in Baroque music, you'll get someone sing, and then Jesus said unto him. That that sort of idea, okay? Now, a cadential progression is the chords that lead up to that, okay? So you might get... And the nice thing about that is once it starts, there comes a moment where you go, oh, I know what's going to happen next. Yeah? If I try in the minor. And you know that this next chord is coming because we expect it. Yeah, the musical, the way the music is constructed and the kind of the way the style is constructed leads us to believe that this cliche that we're expecting is going to happen. And so that is what we would think of as an established cadential progression. These were still quite new in the Baroque era. They had grown in the late Renaissance, and it was composers like Corelli and Vivaldi and Bach and Handel and so on who really used them until they were just absolutely embedded in people's expectations. You'll also hear things like use of sequence and repetition in Baroque music, what we call the circle of fifths. Now, we've briefly spoken about the circle of fifths, but just to give you an idea what the circle of fifths would sound like, it would sound something like this. And of course that can just go round and round and round again, because all we're doing is we're going from the fifth of one key to the fifth of the next to the next to the next, and what happens is you end up going round in a circle and ending up back where you started. And this you'll hear a lot of this in Baroque music, and the golden ratio as well. This idea of in architecture of the perfect balance of size and structure. These principles are applied to Baroque music as well. And we'll talk more about prepared suspensions and section lengths on another session. I'd like to play you a little bit more of this lovely, lovely music. Now, this is, we've been speaking about Corelli, so let me just show you what he looked like, we think. I mean, this is one of those examples where all we have is an engraving or two. Hang on, I'm just going to see if I can make him a little bit bigger for you. There he is. There's old Archie. Okay, Arcangelo Corelli. And if you've never heard of him, can I recommend wholeheartedly his Concerti Grossi? Okay, we'll talk more about concertos in a future session. The Baroque era was really where the idea of the concerto grew, and you have solo concertos, which are for individuals to show off. And you have concerti grossi, which are small group concertos. So you have a whole orchestra, and then you have 3 or 4 soloists who play as little groups. So you have a little bit with just the soloists, and then you have a bit with the whole group, just the soloist group, and so on. Okay, Corelli was largely responsible for these. And Corelli is massively important to music, and not just Baroque music. I mean, music in general. He was, well, first of all, he was an absolute perfectionist. He published a relatively small number of works because he laboured over them. I mean, really, he in fact, in some cases, he published and then withdrew the works from publication so he could rework them and put them out again. I mean, some people in music academia think that he overworked them. You know, he flogged them a little bit too much. In actual fact, what he produced were these absolute beautifully polished marvels where every single note is placed exactly where it should be. So let's have a little bit more Corelli. So this is carrying on with the Christmas concerto with the same ensemble. We've just had this long kind of sinuous line with all these interweaving lines. Now we're going to have something a little bit faster. Okay, so let's have a listen to a fast movement from Corelli. There's your circle of fifths and the cadential progression. Now repeats. This is a sequence. Cadence coming up, and You can see, you can sort of hear where it's going. Anyway, I'm going to interrupt there. Ever so sorry, Arcangelo, to break the seamless flow. How horrible of me. Well, if you're enjoying that, do please, as I say, listen to more of Corelli's work. His music is genuinely remarkable. Did you hear as that started? You had this line where one part started, then another one went slightly above, then that line went above, then above, then above. And what Corelli's doing is playing long notes that go over the bar line that then clash with the next note to come in, that clash with the next note, and so it is impeccably produced. I mean, immeasurably beautifully constructed. Those of you who like puzzles and Sudoku and so on, what Corelli was doing hundreds of years ago is no less impressive than any feats of maths or so. And it's all hugely mathematical. Okay, music in its and maths have evolved together, and here you see almost really the pinnacle of musical form and structure combined with with maths to create sheer beauty and that seamless flow that Corelli was talking about, or that the academics have been talking about. Let me very quickly, just before we wrap things up with one more quick bit of listening, I want to talk to you very quickly just a bit more about the harpsichord here, folks. And I've got something here on screen. I hope you can make it out. What I'll have to do is to share these slides, I think, after the presentation. So here are some of the main features that you'll hear. If you're listening to something and you think, is this Baroque? So first of all, does it have a lot of dynamic contrast? Is it suddenly loud, suddenly quiet? Might not be Baroque if it is. Does it have a harpsichord? If you hear the harpsichord, chances are it may well be a Baroque piece or a piece written in the Baroque style. Is it polyphonic? And that little piece we were just listening to with those overlapping lines is a good example of polyphony. We'll talk more about that. But the basso continuo is where the harpsichord sits in the sound. And I don't know if any of you have heard the terms basso continuo before. Basso, obviously, bass continuo. This is absolutely fascinating. You won't find this after about 1760, 1770. It very much fell out of favour. But the basso continuo was a small team that worked at the lower end of the sound and basically supported everybody else. It was the way in which the composer or the leader of the ensemble would direct. So there was no conductor, there was nobody stood in front waving their arms around. That didn't really come along until the 19th century with people like Wagner and Berlioz. So composers would sit instead at the keyboard and they would play the harpsichord. And so if I was playing along with this thing in G minor, I might go with nice big sort of obvious body language to move things along. If you are a member of Self-Isolation Choir, you remember Lawrence Cummings, who was the harpsichordist. If you watch him at the start of the Messiah video, he goes, and gives us this nice big spread chord. And if you listen, the harpsichordist doesn't play a block chord, doesn't go that sort of sound. The sound is spread like this. And so on. And the spreading is so that sound, which is a very piercing sound, that harpsichord, it's a very penetrating sound, can move throughout the ensemble and that everybody can hear despite them playing along. That's what's going on there. And the harpsichord is always paired with a cello and a double bass, who play the bass line, which is the lowest part in the harmony. And so what you'll find, if you have a look, and all of these scores are available for you to find for free. If you put in Corelli Concerto PDF, you can find thousands of scores for free, all legal. IMSLP is a really good website for that. And you'll see at the bottom, you'll see the bass line with some numbers written underneath, which we'll talk about another time. That's the basso continuo line, and that is for the cello, the double bass, and the harpsichord, all at the bottom. They're like a team. Okay, they're like the drum, the drummer and the bassist in a rock group. Okay, they hold everyone together. There's no conductor. It's all driven from the bass line. Let's have a little bit more Corelli. Okay, so let's let's just pick up where we were. So I'm just going to press play and then bring the volume up. So this is this lovely fast movement, and you can hear this cascading line. harpsichord at the bottom. Hear the spread. And all these predictable cadences. And again. Repeated material, here's your cadence. There we go. So that's just a very, very quick introduction, ladies and gentlemen, to the Baroque era. We'll talk more next week, because I'd like to introduce you next week to the godfather, the grandfather of modern music. So we'll talk next week about Johann Sebastian Bach. It'll only be half an hour. I could talk for weeks about Bach without playing a note of his music. So it's going to be a very truncated half hour. But we'll learn how Bach started as a composer, where he produced most of his work, and really what the impact of Bach's involvement on choral music was, which is of course essential. But I hope you found that interesting, everybody. I had a lovely time chatting about music. I could just sit here and gas on all day, as you probably can probably tell. Go and listen to some Corelli. I promise you'll love it. If you can find on authentic instruments, you will get the absolute perfect sound. It'll be at the right pitch, the strings will be made of the right stuff, it'll all sound lovely. So anyway, I will see you folks tomorrow on for our next Quarantine Choir broadcast. If we're in self-isolation choir, of course we have Lift Thine Eyes later tonight, and I look forward to seeing some of you there. Otherwise, we'll be throwing another shrimp on the barbie tomorrow, everybody. So in the meantime, folks, have a great day, and cheers, see you soon, bye bye.